Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Policy Research. And we are going to have a very interesting, also curious talk. Is a model minority an acceptable minority? Indian Americans and the US presidential polls. This talk by Professor Amit Gupta, our very own Amit, who was here. He started his career here as a assistant, and from here he went to Delhi University, Australian National University, then from there to University of Illinois, and he taught at US Air Force Air War College. Now he's associated with the Forum for Federations, Ottawa, Canada. A little bit about the topic today. Exactly a week from now, next Tuesday, November 5th, the United States is going to the presidential polls. And last time when Professor Gupta was here in June, he spoke about prospects of that election. So we are not going to go back to that. And I want to recall that at that time, hardly anybody was talking about J.D. Vance as a likely vice presidential candidate for Trump. And probably we are one of those people to predict and got vindicated. So today there won't be much predictions, but much more serious, especially from the Indian point of view. Indians in dozens of countries are very prominent, successful, law-abiding minority, and merited to get the tag that model minority because of their hard work, their diligence, and not much on the bad side of the law compared to some minorities. But if you look at the history, the model minority suddenly finds itself that it is no longer a model minority, despite whatever it has done and not done. That happened time and time again. So whatever might be the result next week, Indians are going to be celebrated and commented upon for their success. You know, the way Asian values, how Asians and Japanese were coming up, and people wanted to have the reasons for that. What made Japanese successful now? What made Chinese successful? The third, what made Indian successful? Is it their food habits or their culture, their language, their religion? So all those things are going to come in future. But as Indians, we would like to focus on the critical question: how far we as a nation are doing what is required in terms of promoting our interests and ensuring that Indians not only become successful, but acceptable, which is not an automatic thing if you look at the history. I don't want to second guess Professor Gupta on this. So with that very ambiguous introduction, let me invite Amit to share his views on the topic.
Well, thank you once again, Shyam Babu, for the kind invitation. And, you know, what I'll try and do today is something very simple. I'm going to try and go through 3 questions and talk about the elections also, because after all, it's anybody's guess, but I'll give you what my guess is. And I want to end by giving you some idea of Kamala Harris so that as part of the discussion we have, we can discuss diaspora, culture, identity, these kinds of things. So, you know, the first thing I really want to say is, when does a diaspora go from being a grouping in itself to becoming a grouping for itself? When does it actually achieve a diasporic identity? And if you look at it, there are entire groups around the world which are diasporas, but they don't call themselves that. So if you go in the United States, if you go up in Minnesota and Wisconsin and states like that, lots of Swedes and Norwegians, and Germans, they do not see themselves as a diaspora. Germans in the Volgograd region of Russia do see themselves as a diaspora. Why? Because they're so well integrated that there is absolutely no question of looking for a second identity or an alternative identity. I'll give you an example. I used to be married to a Swedish American woman, And I was the person in that family who knew more about Sweden than anybody there because they'd never been there. I actually had gone all the way from the north of Sweden all the way down to the islands and Skåne. But this is what typically diasporic groups are. They forget their roots. What makes you a diasporic group where you act and behave in concert? It's two things. It's either there is a calamity at home, or your own status within your host nation is being challenged, so on. So really, in the United States, you see the Irish get together as a diaspora very strongly because of the discrimination they face in the 20s and 30s. And you have to remember, in the United States, the Irish did not become technically white till 1932, because that was when they went through yet another one of those Chinese exclusion acts. So they said, okay, what do we do with the Irish? Because they don't look Chinese, and we kind of look down on them because they're Catholic and backward and so on. So somebody then very reluctantly said, oh, we've got to make them white. The same thing happens with that Italians after the Second World War. It's only after the Voting and Civil Rights Act of 1964 that the Italians are recognized as being white. Before that, they were in some ambiguous category that nobody could quite figure out. But you see the case of the Irish mobilizing as the Irish. After the Second World War, you see the Japanese mobilizing as the Japanese, which they didn't do before that, really. And I'll come to the Indians in that case. The other thing which mobilizes them is something catastrophic at home. And the best example of this is the Armenians. Okay. If you look at the Armenians, they're largely concentrated in the Los Angeles area, hence the Kardashians. Okay. But these people, apart from their personal lifestyles, what is interesting is they were actually able to mobilize and get the United States Congress to declare the Turkish killing of Armenians, the Armenian massacre, and a genocide, for which Turkey is extremely upset to this day. And this, by the way, only happened 10 years ago. Okay, so it's not something which happened in the 20s or 30s, but you saw people organizing and mobilizing. The other part in organizing and mobilizing is there's a professor at Emory University called Deepika Chakalia who says we are now in the age of digital diasporas. Okay, I mean, think back to Fijian Indians or Trinidadian Indians. They had no contact with this country, but they managed to retain their language, and they managed to retain their religion, so on. Today, everybody has contact with their homeland. So it can be Indians getting on the web early in the morning and reading newspapers, watching their shows on YouTube, watching their subscriptions, getting their cricket channels. Everything is there. Okay. That kind of connectivity has led to a different agenda for diasporic communities. And I'll give you the other side of this. Indians are very complicated. But in the case of Moroccans who emigrated to Holland, they got into the digital diaspora thing because they started getting satellite broadcasts from home. But the only channels they got were the conservative Moroccan religious channels. Hence, you see the outbreak, partly, of religious fundamentalism amongst Moroccan groups and the killing of Theo van Gogh in Holland. So that part of it is there. Now, you've seen mobilization become better and better as technology becomes better and better. But it hasn't stopped people getting together under the national identity. In the 70s and 80s, long before the internet, the Irish in Boston and New York were putting together money to send to the IRA. And at that point of time, the US had not declared the IRA a terrorist organization. So you have to keep this in mind. Do you have discrimination in your host country? Okay, now I've become an Indian. Do you have discrimination in your home country? Okay, now I've become a Sikh, now I've become a Kashmiri, now I've become something else. That is essentially when a diaspora goes from being a diaspora in itself to a diaspora for itself, which starts talking about what are the issues, how do we mobilize, how do we create an action plan, how do we get policy outcomes. So what has been the Indian case here? And before I get into that, I know you all know this, but it's always good to go through the ethnography, if we can, very quickly, of what is the Indian diaspora. And then we can talk a bit about identity also, because that's a very complex issue as far as they're concerned. Okay, we need to go back, I think, to the first slide. Yeah. There we go. Okay, second one, please. Yeah. Look, Devesh Kapoor at Pennsylvania did this study. And what he's done is he's included every Indian, ranging from Indians who've gone as students to Indians with green cards to Indian citizens. And he ends up with a figure of 5.1 million. It's actually about 4.9 million if you take out the 200,000 students who study there. 66% of this population is migrant. And till recently, it's been a community which is overwhelmingly democratic. 84% of the community voted for Barack Obama. As you can see, they've now gone down to 68% supporting the Democrats. And we can talk about that if you like. They also carry their national traditions, heritage, religion, and prejudices across borders. And those go from generations, they don't change, unfortunately. Many years ago, I interviewed Raja Ramanna in Urbana, Illinois. And he asked me, Mr. Gupta, what do Indians behave like in the United States? He says, okay. I said, let me give you the example close to your heart. In Chicago, there is a Tamil association, a Tamil Brahmin association, and a Sri Lankan Tamil association. And Raja Ramanna flipped out. Because after all, this man is a scientist, an intellectual, and actually a rather good musician. And he says, why did they leave their country if they wanted to bring all this garbage here? And he said, I can understand Sri Lankan Tamils because that is a distinct category. But Tamil Brahmins and Tamils, what's the point? Given that there's probably 400 of you in the whole of Chicago. So it can't be very interesting association meetings. Getting a quorum would not be fun, let's put it that way. But the interesting point about the caste group thing is, this has now become a serious issue in California, where a Dalit who was working for Cisco went and said, look, other Hindus working at Cisco are discriminating against me because I'm a Dalit. And that's why California passed you will not discriminate against people based on caste. And rightfully so. And the last thing is 79%. This is very recent, last two or 3 years. Yeah, it is. And lastly, about 80% have college degrees. And if you take out people who are 65 and older, and you go below 65, it's closer to 100%. Yes. Yeah. Right. They believe that
the same.
it is part of the Cisco thing. No. Yes, this is the Carnegie report, which Devesh Kapoor and Milan Vaishnav and others put together. I've added other things to it, and this will give you an idea why it's wrong. According to them, if you break up the Indian diaspora, 14% of it is Gujarati, 12% is Maharashtrian, which I don't believe, because as a Marathi and having traveled all across America, it's very hard to find one of my Marathi Manuses anywhere. 10% is Telugu, but the number is actually 20% because they've disaggregated the Telanganaites and the Telugus, and they are the largest group now. So that is, and then Delhi becomes 9% for whatever it is. Languages are Hindi, Gujarati, and English. And then there's the question of identity. Sorry. Sorry.
Now languages Hindi, English.
Oh yeah, yeah. The joke in Dallas is that soon you'll have to put up road signs in Telugu and Chinese, because those are the two big minority groups in the state. But the question is, how do they define themselves? And one of the interesting things in going from being a group in itself to a group for itself is you're also defining your own identity and not letting other people define it for you. So in the old days, it was like, what the hell do you call an Indian? So East Asian Indian, South Asian Indian, Indian American. And it's been the Indian women, and you'll see one of them in a minute, but Padma Lakshmi, who, apart from uh, being a supermodel and a rather good chef, I did buy her cookbook, has been one of the people in the forefront on this. And she said, I'm an Indian. I'm also an American. But stop defining me as South Asian, East Asian, whatever your mood swing is today. This is who we are. And that is the majority opinion. It's about 40%. So not majority as much as plurality. The problem is when you start talking Indian American for political mobilization, it becomes something different. And this is where Howdy Modi becomes amusing. The Gujaratis, if you talk to them, don't call themselves Indian American, they call themselves Gujarati American. It is very clear that they have a subnational identity. Sikhs in America now call themselves Sikh American, or I had a colleague who used to call himself South Asian American. I said, that's ridiculous. That's like one of our white colleagues saying, I'm a European American. It's a geographic identity. It's not a cultural identity. But the identities are breaking up now. The identities are breaking up because they're in large enough numbers, they mobilize enough money that they feel confident about who they are. And that's the religious breakup. It's 54% Hindu, though what you would call a Hindu in that 54% is a different issue. And this is the level of political mobilization. And I thought it was rather low, but it actually isn't. It matches that of any American group. If you look at that there, the US born citizens, 18% of them have attended a rally, 17% have been to a public meeting, 26% have performed voluntary community service, and others have worked within their community to solve a problem. These numbers are quite common. Now, the number you should look at is the one in the light blue, which is in the middle, because that's Indians like me, the people who migrated, and their numbers are rather low across the board. The one which I am very skeptical of is what they call community service. Community service to me is going to a soup kitchen, helping clean out garbage on the beach on a Saturday morning, something like that. All right, let me get to the political mobilization part. Okay? And the political mobilization part, this was the model minority. This was the minority which made a lot of money, got educated, didn't get criminal, didn't make movies like The Godfather. So nobody was looking at that. And this comes back to Sham's point. Other communities glorify their violence. The Indians had little violence or no violence to glorify. But they were also the invisible community. Nobody ever saw them. They didn't really have a presence on television. They were not there in the political sphere. You can go down the list on this. What changed? What changed was 9/11, because then they had problems in the home country. Automatically, it became you were dark skinned, you were probably an Arab, you were discriminated against when you boarded a flight. But what was more important, I didn't realize this, but there were probably about 250,000 Indians working for TSA, which is the security people who do the security checks at the airport. They were all thrown out because they had green cards. And so they lost their livelihood. They had to become citizens to come back to that. So that's when you start seeing this group come together, mobilize and say, what do we do about discrimination? And one of the things the younger community did was we have to put more and more Indians into public office. And they started pushing for that. Now, you know all the big names, the Pramila Jaipals and the Raja Krishnamurtis and so on. But what was far more interesting was what happened at the city level. A whole bunch of Indian women, particularly, not so much Indian men, got into city councils. And you know Nitya Raman. The other one is Shama Sawant. Do you know Shama Sawant? No. Shama Sawant is the very interesting one. And she is actually a Marathi in Seattle. She got onto the Seattle City Council and said, I'm a socialist, first one elected since 1906. So here's what we're going to do. The city of Seattle will push for a $15 minimum wage. First city in the country to do that, thanks to her. So it gets passed. When she comes up for re-election, Amazon, who absolutely hate her, and where is Amazon headquartered? In the Seattle area, give her opponent 5 times. That part of it is the interesting part. The other part in it is the big shift has been Indian. Remember, I said the identity is Indian. So what you see now is Indians not apologizing for being Indian in the public sphere. So you're Pramila Jaipal, you're not Polly Jaipal, you're Raja Krishnamurti, you're, Rokhanna may be the one exception to that one. But on the Republican side, there was Piyush Jindal, who went by the alias Bobby, and said, once I moved to America, we were American. I have nothing to do with India. And the other is Namrata Randhawa, who goes by the alias Nikki Haley. Sorry? Yeah. And as I always say, never trust a person who goes by an alias. What are you trying to hide? Bad character flaw. But even on the Republican side, you end up with Vivek, yeah, what is it again? Ramaswamy. And when he came up, it was really interesting to see the reaction. Firstly, people freaked because A, they couldn't pronounce the name. Vivek was difficult, forget Ramaswamy. 2, he's a Hindu. 3, the man comes from a family that doesn't eat meat. 4, what's going to happen in the White House if he gets in? There was a whole list of things. 1 month later, he becomes far more accepted than the Piyush Jindals and the Namrata Randhavas of the world, because he's giving a particular policy line which is liked in the Republican Party. Even though there are people in the Republican Party who say he's Hindu, he's evil, and Coulter says, I can't vote for you because your parents were Indian. That kind of thing is there. The shift has come in the way that the conservatives have started to think like the Democrats. And nobody's apologizing for this anymore, and nor should they. So 9/11 is the first stage. People start mobilizing. The next generation has come in, which is the US born. And the US born want to participate in politics. They think it's important. And the parents have left them with enough money that they can do these kinds of things. And the goal is by 2030 to have 12 elected members in Congress and push for more. So they're looking to increase the representation in cities, in state legislatures, in the national legislature. And it's not to push an Indian American agenda, because what is an Indian American agenda? You can say it's not really, it doesn't really exist. But what they're trying to do is say, as a minority, we should be in talking about these things. We should make our presence felt. And the issues they're pushing are very secular. Environment is the big one. Labor rights is the second one. The control of technology for ethical purposes is the third one. This is what they're mobilizing. The flip side of mobilization is what happens with everything going on in India. So you have the Sikhs doing everything that they feel they have to do. You have the Gujaratis getting excited about Modi. You have liberal groups of college professors denying Modi a visa for 10 years. And of course, that changes. That group has been moralized, marginalized now. Okay. So that part of it is there. Why do they get the success they do? And it's very interesting that somebody said, look, here's the thing with the Indians, apart from the fact that they're successful and everybody knows an Indian doctor, or the stereotypical Indian techie. The real reason is they're Muslim light. Because after 9/11, you have this prosecution of Muslims across the country, directly or indirectly. And now you come up with this model minority, which you can also pass off as, well, it's from that part of the world. So it becomes more acceptable to certain people, it becomes more acceptable in the media. I can go down the list on that. All right. Having said that, does this model minority go beyond being a model minority to being an acceptable minority? And what do I mean by that? What is the acceptable minority? And there are very few countries in the world where minorities have been completely integrated, well integrated, and accepted. Finland is one. Finland did a very interesting thing. They had a small Swedish minority. They made Swedish the second national language. Of course, no Finn learns Swedish, but officially it's a national language. So everybody's happy. You have a country like that. Indonesia, excellent at dealing with minorities because Javanese was the language spoken by the majority. They got rid of it and they got Bahasa Indonesia, which is really from Kalimantan. And I think it's more or less Malaysian from what I can gather. So there are people who've done things really well to accommodate minorities. And the last one I'll give you is Nigeria, which is a bit of a surprise. After the Civil War, which was quite traumatic and large numbers were killed mainly through starvation, the Nigerian government said there are no winners and there are no losers. And they didn't go out on a witch hunt and kill a lot of Igbos. Instead, they integrated the Igbos into the national government. And in fact, a few years ago, the Nigerian ambassador to the United States came to my university and I got talking with him and he said, look, I used to be the chief propaganda officer of the Igbo army. And today I'm the Nigerian ambassador to the United States. In 30 years, my status has changed from war criminal, traitor, call it what you may, to somebody who is an accepted part of the Nigerian government. People do it, but they tend to be the exceptions. What is the situation in America? And this is where I'll sort of look, what did the Jews do? What the Indians think is, here's how you do political or gain political favor. Go take a photo with Hillary Clinton. Okay. That achieves nothing. And then you blow it up and put a 6-foot poster in your living room. Now, that means nothing. I went to Comic-Con in San Diego and got a photo with Scarlett Johansson, the Black Widow. All that means is I have a photo with Scarlett Johansson. We don't send each other birthday cards. She doesn't inquire about the health of my mother. Okay? But Indians seem to be quite happy with the photograph. So there's that aspect of political mobilization. The other aspect is protecting your status within the country. And really the most effective thing they did was they merged with other Asian American groups and took Harvard to court and got rid of affirmative action at Harvard. And they got the court they wanted, which has now led the Jews to say, why are there so few Jews in Harvard? Well, it's because the Asian Americans are coming in large numbers. That they've done well. The thing they haven't done well, which they haven't understood from the Jews, is to be a minority in a country, to become accepted, to be integrated, you also have to give back. And I'll tell you, go to any major American city, you will see a Jewish hospital. Like I go quite frequently to St. Louis. It has Barnes Jewish Hospital. If you go to New York, you have Cedar Sinai, B'nai B'rith. What kinds of names are these? These were all the Jewish charity hospitals which were set up and essentially made the community not just more acceptable, but it made people have feelings of gratitude. If your grandparents were born in B'nai B'rith, your parents were born in B'nai B'rith, you were born in B'nai B'rith, you tend to have positive feelings. And that to a large extent explains some of the positive feeling in the whole Israel-Gaza thing among the older community in America. Younger community, if you like, I can talk about. Indians don't do that. The Jews set up universities. Indians don't do that. The Jews don't set up scholarships. The Indians don't do that. So if you really want to be an accepted minority, I think you have to understand what the accepted minorities did, and that is to give back to American society. And Indians aren't very good at doing that. Indians are not also very good at giving back to India. Um, and I'll tell you this again, they all want to come and take a photo with Modi or Manmohan Singh. Yeah, I hope he sends you a birthday card after that. I don't think he will. But I wrote this remember when Jagdish Titler was the minister for the Indian diaspora or something? I wrote a report for ORF, which was given to him. And since the last sentence cited him, that's all he cared about. But I said, look, Indian Americans are getting old. They've been in the sciences, engineering, medicine. Their children have gone away. Being Indian Americans, they don't play golf. There's just so much bad television you can watch. Why don't you bring these people back? Give them university positions at Indian university salaries and tell them to contribute to the country. And IIT does that to some extent, by the way. They have the capsule courses, they bring people in, but do it across the country. And you would really bring up a new generation of educated Indians at a very low cost to the nation. And you don't get Delhi University upset because you brought in some guy who had been a professor at the University of Chicago. Okay? That is the kind of thinking that I think you have to go for. The other thing you have to go for, which India does very poorly because India doesn't understand diasporas, is learn from the Irish. Ireland's a country of 4.5 million people. There's 65 million Irish in the diaspora. And they have an office of the Irish diaspora. They also have an office of the Scottish diaspora. I've talked to both because I've written on diaspora. So I asked the Irish people, I said, how do you function? They said, look, 65 million Irish. Some of them are rich, some of them are not rich, but 65 million Irish means we have a captive tourist base. They all want to come back to the mother country, see the village where their great grandmother was born. But the other thing a lot of these people do is they say, look, I'm now a widower, I have no children, and I have $150 million sitting in my bank account. I'll give $100 million to a university in Ireland. And this is what they've been doing. And the Office of the Irish Diaspora does this very well. The Office of the Scottish Diaspora, and this is for the young people, because you'll recognize the names I'm going to come up with, they bring in Scottish, well-known Scottish actors to make Scotland more prominent internationally. But you can learn to bring this diaspora in. You can learn to bring this diaspora to function and contribute to this country. And don't tell me why should they? And the answer is because A, some of them want to, but B, heritage matters. It is a truly powerful thing for people. The Hungarians do it, the Poles do it. Why shouldn't the Indians do it? Which then brings me to the election. And then we'll end with the video. When it comes to the election, let me just say this. She started well. Her problem is a high inflation in the country, which she's not responsible for. Biden is, but she's going to be taking the blame for it. And remember, people vote with their pocketbooks. 2, immigration. Every 4 years, America thinks it's going to be overwhelmed by immigrants. And the Republicans do a good job of that. Again, she's going with the Biden administration policies there. Third thing, which is very important in this, is contrary to all the rubbish you're reading about how Indian women, women in America are up in arms about abortion being taken away and so on, go look at the data, and data matters. Jane June and Natalie Masuoka in Los Angeles did the study on this. They said in every presidential election in the United States, except Goldwater and Johnson, and the other one was Clinton and Dole, white women have voted for the Republican Party. And the reason for that is they listen to their father, their brother, their husband, their Uncle Glenn, who you wouldn't leave alone in the same room with the family dog. You know, these kinds of people have far more influence on this community. And Trump in 2016 got 52% of the white women's vote. In 2020, by when all the sexism charges were out in the open, he'd been accused of rape. And by the way, the judge who convicted him in New York said, if this was a criminal trial, I would not be saying this was assault. I would be saying it was rape. Okay, so technically he's a convicted rapist, but not to in the eyes of many Americans. Trump got 55% of the white vote, women vote. And this time around, despite abortion, I don't think it's going to change. Last thing I'll say is to bring in my father. In the early 60s, my father was a student at MIT. My mother was taking classes at Harvard. And my mother comes home one day and tells my father, American men are so polite. They open doors for you. And my father, who's a good cynical Indian, says, yeah, that may be the case, but they don't like or respect women. What torpedoed Hillary Clinton was a deep lying misogyny. And this is something that American social scientists have a hard time quantifying. The same thing with Kamala Harris. Look at the things that her laugh. Well, I can go around this room and get everybody to laugh. Maybe two of you have a pleasant laugh. The rest of you, I'm sorry. The White House will smell of curry. This is the kind of thing they're attacking her with. And keep this in mind. The reason I think Trump has the edge is the four things I told you. And the last thing is nobody likes Ukraine and Gaza. So Ukraine will screw Biden, Gaza will screw Biden and Harris. Watch this and we can talk about Kamala Harris's identity.
have a very special guest, very special, Senator Kamala Harris. I wonder, is it respectful to call, I would be calling you Senator Harris? No, you should not, that's not on my birth certificate. Okay, Kamala. Because the Indian in me, I feel like my parents might not watch this, don't call me on TV. What we're gonna do today is an Indian recipe. Yes. Because you are, okay, and I know that everybody knows that, but I find that wherever I go and I see a supermarket, on the street, everyone's, oh, there's Indian, right? It's like our thing we're so excited about that have people running for president. So we're both Indian. Yes. Actually, we're both South Indian. Yes. We look like the entire one half of my family. Okay, thank you. You too. I can tell you're really already. I'm just perfect. So you can share. And so were you raised eating South Indian? South Indian food, lots of rice, potato curry, lots of Asian. That's a deep cut. Okay, so what we're cooking today is two things. One of the South Indian staples is dosa, which is kind of like a sourdough.
You can end it whenever you like. It's 8 minutes. Whenever you like.
South Indian food, yes, extremely excited.
Actually, wait a minute. She show her mother and yeah, just one more minute. You can see her family.
It was actually a thing. Apparently, there's a thing. Okay, cool. So this is all the spices we're gonna use, I with my dad, and then just take a really long time to make.
Yeah.
So what we have is this great company, it's Indian company actually, makes ready to make, you can get it in Indian stores, so for busy, it's very,
Okay,
so
it's pretty big. So South Indians is vegetarian, it's all vegetarian. So when we were growing up and we go to India and my grandfather was a little mischievous. So my grandmother, of course, was like strictly no, nothing. If it had a mother, it was not getting eaten. And if my grandmother would go out of town, my grandfather would then, he'd get very mischievous and he'd say, okay, let's have French toast. Because of course that is.
Chicken and French toast?
So when I would go to
Eggs.
the museum, no, even a dog,
Right.
no, very good Hindu vegetarians, but then I'd get older cool cousins
Stop.
who would take
Yeah.
me out in their motorcycles and we would go get.
So give us the context.
See, here's my question to all of you and anybody who's watching this on, and you know, if you want to see the end of it, you can see it because she gives a very Tamil response to Mindy after Mindy makes a very bad dosas because Mindy obviously didn't make the dosas from scratch while Kamala Harris's mother did. So she says to Kamala Harris, what do you think of my dosas? And Kamala Harris gives the Tamil Brahmin response, it's okay. It is. And it starts from there. But here's the thing, this is obviously somebody who's brought up in Indian culture, deeply rooted in South Indian culture. Why can't she show that to the rest of America? And B, why do Indians have such a hard time accepting this woman? Because for those of you who go and see how she cuts her onions, she cuts her onions in those little squares, which I cannot do. You know, I just go whack, chop, throw it all in. She cuts them the way a proper Indian chef would do. This woman is Indian for all intent and purposes with a black name tag. Why does the Indian community have a hard time? The Indian community accepts Tulsi Gabbard. She's not accepted by the Indian community. And why can't she be an Indian to the American community? And then we can talk about the whole thing about minorities, identities, so on. I'll leave it at that. Questions, comments?
Before I open it, thank you, Amit. You know, ever since we started talking about this topic, you know, one instance or one case that has been haunting me is the Jews. You know, 400 years, they were an accepted or model minority in Egypt. One of them could even become prime minister.
Right.
But suddenly after 400 years, they did not do anything different. But suddenly they became enemy. And most of the cases wherever we see minorities suffering suddenly, it's mostly to do with the dynamics of the majority community. As long as they are confident, rich, secure, they have the tolerance and the minorities thrive. And the moment there are some problems, some insecurities among the majority community, then they start looking for scapegoats and enemies. What can any minority do? And my specific question is, partly you answered it, what can Indians, American Indians or Indian Americans do? Indians. And with regard to Indians in US, am I right in saying that if I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we are somehow stuck at the family level and community level? We are unable to go beyond, even in generations. And my third question is, you know, according to Devesh Kapoor et al. Study, they indicate that from third generation onwards, that Indianness, the roots start petering out. Would you agree with that? Yeah, those are the three before I open.
Look, yeah, the roots do start petering out. The thing is, I mean, what's interesting is J.D. Vance's elder child is also a Vivek, and he would be third generation. because J.D. Vance's wife would be second generation. So there is an ability to keep community going. And I would, if you're ever interested, read about the Fijian Indian community or the Trinidadian Indian community and how they kept Indian traditions going. Even though they were intermarrying, surprisingly, caste broke down in these places because you had to marry somebody and you weren't going to find another Patel in a group of three. So that kind of thing worked to their advantage. But I think where the Indianness may stay is food, music, heritage. This they're not going to give up that easily. And the other thing is they used to be ashamed of India. Now they realize India is a different kind of country. And now identifying with India benefits them. So if you go to Washington now, there's large numbers of Indian Americans who made a business out of being Indian American. So they go and work for the Stimson Center, Carnegie, wherever. And the reason they're kept is because they're Indian American, because they can communicate better with the Indians. And they can communicate better with the donors, if there are any donors in the community. That's Indianness. The other thing, surprisingly, which leads to the Indian community staying together is essentially matrimonial economics. I mean, there's enough studies being done on this that people marry within their own socioeconomic groups. Indians marry Indians because your median family income is $145,000 a year. You just made that $290,000. Why not? So that aspect of it is there. On Maslow's, look, unless they go beyond family and local community, they will always be vulnerable. That would be my argument. Simply, the dynamics of the majority community. I think the problem is Germany was the example we always took. General Banerjee, you know this. 1/4 of all the Iron Crosses won by the Wehrmacht in World War I were won by German Jews. You cannot be more integrated than that, where you win the highest honor, military honor of a country while being a minority. They did that. 10 years later, they were being shipped to concentration camps. It was that kind of thing, 20 years later. The thing is, we have changed as societies. We do understand that. At the same time, we have to be constantly vigilant. And I know that sounds like a platitude or a throwaway line, but the best way Indians can work on this is the way they worked on opening up admissions in elite universities. If you talk as Indians, you're not very powerful. You talk with Koreans and Chinese, you are. Excuse me. Sorry, that's it.
Narayani, you have some question?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Narayani. My first question to you is that does the model minority stereotype actually hinder Indian Americans from being seen as fully integrated citizens? And does this limit them to the one-dimensional narrative of success?
Yeah, why not? Did we get anybody watching this online? Yes. Oh, there are. Cool.
Would you like to take specific?
No, I was just curious. I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to, yeah. Yeah, please.
Okay, so you mentioned the Fijians and the Irish, and in particular, you mentioned about how the Fijians had kept their traditions going and quote unquote Indianness. So I was thinking a very interesting, the same sensibilities and the same worldviews, but a very different and a very contrasting counterpoint would be the Tibetan community in India, where they forswear self-consciously as a group and also at the political level as well as each individual level to forswear citizenship and do come out winning by scripting a very powerful identity for themselves and doing a marvelous job at branding, and which speaks far more than their numbers. Just your thoughts on that.
Okay. I'll answer that, absolutely. And I think this is where the Jews also have success. They've been very good at mobilizing, organizing, and as you call it, scripting. The narrative, I mean, everybody in America knows about the Holocaust. The Tibetans, yes. I mean, I'll add one thing to this though. This is where I think every Indian should give themselves a pat on the back. India doesn't do anything to harm the interests of the Tibetan community or in any way tell them that you have to integrate fully or discriminate even. All those things are there. India even allowed Nancy Pelosi to meet their prime minister, which that's a bit of tongue in cheek there, but obviously, I think the Tibetans are like the Jews in that sense. Conscious of their identity, fact that the identity is based on great tragedy, and therefore they work in a particular direction. They're also lucky that they're in a country like this, which allows them to express themselves. And there are not really that many of them left. I'm not sure, I mean, this is for the young people. You would know this. How much intermarriage is there now between Tibetans and Indians? And I would actually say anybody who's been born in this country is an Indian. They may be a Tibetan and they may be told about the great days when the Pancham Lama and the Dalai Lama were frolicking in the gardens in Lhasa. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of their behavior, in terms of the schools they went to, their culture, I'm sure they're all cricket fans by now. So, I mean, and that's to the young people. Have you seen a lot of intermarriage or no intermarriage, or it never struck you? Is that a yes, a no, or a I'm thinking about it? Okay, think about it and let me know. No, I think that's a very good example of a diaspora which punches above its weight.
So forswears citizenship.
Yeah.
Strong Indian government policy to support both Tibetan identity, so about traditional friendship, connected to religion, way of life, and of course, our perception that they were persecuted.
Right.
In fact, we have something to contribute toward that. And so the governmental support to Tibetan positions in India has been quite substantial and effective. I say that because I belong to Dharamsala. My
The Gorkha
regiment
regiment.
home is Dharamsala.
Hmm.
And in my company line, my unit line, the government of India funded operations function. So there has been an active measure of support to the Tibetans, which is a different case from any other country.
It's, yeah, look, sorry.
Well, in South India as well, similar things. And everywhere, there's separate district and they have been definitely supported, various people.
So, no, sir, very interesting that despite proactive government support, to have the community decide self-consciously to forswear citizenship is a fundamental act of, of self-identity as a group.
We've allowed them to retain their identity and still find acceptance in Indian society. That's a good contribution of the Indian.
Well, you both made me think of one thing. If for some reason they're forced to take an Indian citizenship, the Indian government is not going to sit there and say, oh, no, we can't really do, it'll be, of course, welcome to India, you're already here, right? Well, this is not a xenophobic country in that sense. But to answer your question on does a model minority, the image limit integration? Absolutely. Look, what disappoints me about the Indian uh, minority and the Asian minority in general is they don't participate in the events which make you an American. I'm still waiting for the Indian who plays American football. So far, it hasn't happened.
Tough game to play.
Sorry?
Tough game to play.
Tough game to play, and just the body mass isn't there. Or plays baseball, or plays some other game like that. Indians are going into Hollywood in very large numbers now. And they are making presence mainly because, as somebody said, and I wrote an article on this, it's called Indian is the New Black, the Rise on Indian Americans on Television. It's in the round table about 7 years ago. And what was interesting was two things. A lot of the people who make television shows and movies in Hollywood are now in their mid-20s to late 30s. And they grew up in high school with Indians. So having an Indian as a cast member for them is not something which is extraordinary. They're like, yeah, Pepi Patel, he and I used to hang out together. And I wanted to date his sister, Missy Patel, but the family wouldn't let me. So that kind of thing is always there. The other reason they've brought in Indians is, as I said, it's Muslim light, that you can have a dark-skinned person who is obviously othered, who is foreign, but guess what? They're acceptable to us. They're non-threatening. And you compare that with how few Muslims there are, Aziz Ansari, a couple of others. The guy whose father migrated from Britain to America because he found out that Americans had brunch. If anybody remembers the name of this guy, please. Yeah, he's also an actor. I remember his name. I can't remember his, sorry, I remember his face. I can't remember his name. It'll come back.
Anybody else? Yeah, please. You ask first.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'd like it very small one. One is quite diverse. First, you have made a mention high inflation in the West. Right, it's not a US phenomenon, sir. It's an international worldwide phenomenon. That is, I call it the loss of purchasing power. Purchasing power of the people out of the world is going down and every day. Every day of the year or whatever you say. So US is not the exception. So it is everywhere. Here and through, go to any country, it is there. One. Number two, about the Indian diaspora. I had that, like you have the opportunity, I think you're from US. So I had the opportunity to be abroad, living abroad for 15, 16 years. And I've been working with the youths, Indian youths and other youths, and the youths from all countries. So my perception experience, what I perceived as at the ground level, grassroots level, is that Indians still practice, we have practiced caste system here, then north and south, then the east and west, and the Gujaratis and the Punjabis and the Tamil Walas, the Madrasi they call them. So this kind of feeling is they still carrying abroad. I give you example. For example, the Indian, the NRIs, we call them from in the US. They don't want to integrate with the Indians in UK. UK Indians, they wouldn't intermarry, they wouldn't interact with them. This is one. They're in the East, the Indians in the East. And then the Fiji, the most neglected people. I met youth and worked with them. I worked with the West Indies people, right? The West Indian people, the most, the regret they have, the West Indian people, you know what they say? Bharat ne hame bhula diya. They cry because nobody want to talk to them. Nobody want to interact with them. Nobody want to marry them. And the Indian government, even Indian government rejects them. The same is with the Indian population in South Africa and other way.
So please ask.
Migrated. So the question is, the Indian continue to behave caste or status system. See, they're status conscious people. They don't want to integrate even amongst their own people. Thank you.
Hmm. Yeah, high inflation is a global phenomenon, but if you're an American voter, you're just looking at it in the American context. And in the American context, if your food bill has gone up by 50%, you blame Joe Biden. It's a simple, and which means you blame Kamala Harris. On the diaspora, I couldn't agree more. It's, look, when I joined JNU, V.M. Dandekar, the noted Indian economist, was on the committee to set up the university, formulate the rules, and so on. And one of the things V.M. Dandekar said was, in the hostels, we will have no karmacharis. Let the students clean the toilets, let the students cook their food. Okay? Now, JNU was set up, what, 69, 70, who remembers? So it's been what, 52 years? Long. Sorry?
70.
Why is it 70?
The Institute International.
Oh, yeah. That, well, if you take that, if you take SIS, yeah. Yes, and Pushpesh Pant was in all 70 of them. So I gather. But I mean, look, the thing is, why have we not been able to institutionalize that kind of social change in a so-called elite university? Okay. They get all the kids in Ganga Hostel and Sutlej Hostel and Godavari Hostel to clean their own toilets. I mean, we will not do that. And until you do that, you can't change this country. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi said the same thing 100 years ago, 120 years ago.
Modi also said the same thing.
Who? Sorry?
Modi ji.
Modi also said the same thing. Look, you can't, if you're taking caste abroad, as I said, Raja Ramanna is right. Why did you leave your country? You left to go and do something better, create something better. So we can't do that. We're also very racist. I mean, and this is why I showed you the Kamala Harris one, and we haven't, nobody's answered my two questions, but I'll give you one answer. She was brought up by her Tamil Brahmin mother. And you saw the family, it's quite progressive, as she said about her grandfather. Why is it she's not identifying as Indian? And it's not about the vote, because Vivek Ramaswamy is identifying as Indian. He's not calling himself Viv Ramaswamy. Okay. I think about the inherent racism of the Indian community. And I've asked this of Indians in various cities in America. I said, do you think Kamala Harris was pushed to become Black because the Indian community of that time rejected her mother and these two kids? And they all say, absolutely. They don't even try and apologize. They don't even try and fudge it. And this is the thing you've got to keep in mind. You see that little clip I showed you. This woman is 100% Indian. She thinks Indian. Don't call me auntie. Okay. No Black woman is going to say that in America. Every Indian woman of a certain age is going to say that. But the reason is, if her deadbeat father had been a white guy from Oklahoma, would she have been loved by the Indian community? They would have been wonderful. And if we can't change these things, don't tell other people to treat us with greater respect or so on. And I'll say one thing to you. If you look at the Chinese diaspora, Chinese are very pragmatic. They marry everywhere they go. They don't care. Even in Africa, by the way. That is the Chinese. The Indians, not marrying an African charity. There's very little to do with actual human capital. And I'll say this, I'll just add one thing. Sorry, you got me on my high horse preaching now. But the guy who got this right was Ashok Modi, who wrote the book on India's economy, which is hated by everybody in Delhi. because it says some uncomfortable truths. But what does Modi say? India doesn't create jobs. India doesn't invest in human capital. I mean, I'm sorry, you're right.
It is natural today, since the topic is about model minority. We talked about minorities and especially Indians as minority, and we bashed them for quite good reasons. But let me ask you the flip side of this. Again, take the example of Jews throughout history. 1900 years, they remained as minorities. When they tried to integrate, pure German blood or pure Dutch blood, when they decided to remain aloof, the very word ghetto itself is from Italy for Italian, this Jewish enclaves. So again, you're back to the same problem that how much a minority does or doesn't do. But overall, again, it depends on the majority community. How do you square this?
Thank you. It's difficult, and you're pointing out why, even in the best of conditions, they can flip very easily. And I don't minimize that or trivialize that. I think firstly, you've got to try and educate the majority. Secondly, you've got to contribute to the well-being of the majority. And the third thing is you have to be seen as a vibrant part of that society. It doesn't get you anywhere. I want to see the first Indian woman who becomes Taylor Swift or whatever it is, the same kind of thing. Because that, and I don't say she becomes a billionaire and dates a loser football player from Kansas City, but what I do say is if she becomes an international or an American pop star, that is the American mainstream. The more people you have doing these things, the more accepted you are. And you have to open, I mean, you know, Sham, just to come back to one thing, you said the Indianness diminishes. At what stage do they stop being Hindu? And I don't think they will, right? Because the leap to go from Hindu to being Roman Catholic or Jehovah's Witness may be quite large. So that part of it will keep them as a visible minority or a discernible minority. But you have to keep working at acceptance. I think that's what I'm getting from what you're saying. And it's not easy.
So I think on that positive note, we can end, please. Any questions?
There is a question on the Zoom.
On Zoom.
What's up?
Okay, the same. Are there any latest data-driven studies at the regional level in India and the reception of Kamala Harris' participation in the US elections? Your opinions on how Kamala Harris' loss win will influence Tambram discourse in Tamil Nadu? It's quite asking to explain relativity theory.
3 or 4 questions there. I'm not sure which one to. Which one do you want me to answer?
I haven't really got the full question.
Yeah, it seemed like strung together several questions. Look, Kamala Harris's election will do squat for US-India relations, and it will do nothing for Tamil Brahmins in Tamil Nadu because they've all been kicked out of Tamil Nadu. I mean, this is a fact. If you look at look at Brahmins across India. I'm half Bengali, half Marathi. My Bengali side, my chief minister is a Brahmin, Mamata Banerjee, nominally at least. In Maharashtra till recently, the chief minister was a Brahmin, Devendra Fadnavis. Neither state has problems with that. Till the chief of the Indian Air Force changed, all three chiefs of the military till about a month ago were Brahmins. These are highly integrated. Nobody talks about Brahmins being excluded, except in Tamil Nadu, where they still talk about the anti-Brahminic movement. Old memories die hard and grudges die hard too. So Kamala Harris becoming president is going to do nothing for that one. Also, I know a Tamil Iyengar woman who said, couldn't her mother have found anybody better than a black man? And I said, that is the problem with you. It's your kind of racism which leads people like me to hold you in abject contempt. Okay. So nothing's going to happen. And do you think Kamala Harris is going to come to Tamil Nadu and stand on that beach that that MGR used to go on and go, Thai Kulame, I've come to talk to you. Thai Kulame is motherhood in Tamil. She probably speaks fluent Tamil because having a Tambram mother that was drilled into her, she's not going to do it. And again, because you rejected her. By the way, is she an Iyengar or an Iyer? Does anybody know? I've heard both. Do you know? This because that would also explain other patterns of behavior, so to speak. But no, that part of it is there. In the United States, she loses because the domestic economy, people aren't confident about it. And it's very close. I would be happy to be proven wrong and that she becomes president. The war in Ukraine is not liked. Young people do not like the war in Gaza. And that's led to a real split with the Democratic Party. And do not underestimate American misogyny. This is something which no American social scientist wants to talk about. And by the way, whenever you get one of these American social scientists come in and talk to you, and it always starts up with America, the most wonderful, progressive, brilliant nation in the world, world's greatest democracy. Nowadays, I ask the most basic question. My question is simply this. If you are the world's greatest democracy, why are you the only liberal democracy in the world where after 4 years, your candidate has still to acknowledge defeat? Normally that happens in places like Liberia, the Cote d'Ivoire, Fiji, so on. It doesn't happen in a white liberal democracy. And what does that tell you about the United States of America? Don't give lectures to people. Those days are long gone. The US is also the only country in the world which invaded a country by mistake or under false pretenses. There were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. This is what happened.
What you said just reminded me of this American sociologist. I think he's from, I think Yale, Elijah Anderson, who's very interesting work on being black in a white space, and he, theorizes and ideates on what white space means. So some of what you said actually resonates with a lot of what ethnographic and sociological work that he's done.
Just remember this, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, all have I love Israel tattooed on their backs. But the thing is, young Americans don't think that way. Young Americans have seen a different world. And why am I saying that to you? Black Lives Matter labeled Israel an apartheid state. And again, to the young people, oh, you didn't know that. And it's a thing. Black Lives Matter is far more important, vibrant than the Republican Party because it mobilizes on the streets. The Republican Party mobilizes in the golf courses, Mar-a-Lago. So, but that's good.
Okay, can I ask you one supplementary question, which is personal question? I remember when you were an Indian, you were super critical of India. Now you're an American. You have become super critical of America. What does that tell about Professor Amit Gupta?
It's Look, I'm still super critical of India, but it's like I gave a talk at Center for Land Warfare Studies annual conference. And everybody was going on about China and Pakistan. I said, no, your real problems are number one, education, which is in a downward spiral, and it's a security issue. Number two is healthcare, it's a security issue. Number three is the environment. You live in the most polluted city in the world. Congratulations. So the whole room went quiet and I got some very hostile looks. But here's the thing. You really want to be poisoned for the rest of your life? That would be my question to you here. And I can go on about this. In the United States, here's what I feel. Somebody asked me, what's your attitude to life? And I said, imagine life as a 50 over ODI. Okay. 50 over one day international. I am in the 40th over, and I borrowed this from her uncle. So, okay. So I have to give credit where credit is due. I'm in the 40th over, and I'll be thrilled if I get a super over, or as happened in the 2019 World Cup, which the young people have already forgotten, you get 2 super overs. Okay. You people are in the 10th, 12th, 14th over of your life. What makes us add value to our lives now is to leave a world behind that is better for you. So if I am critical of America today, it's not because I give a damn about Trump, Biden, Kamala Harris, the very gay Lindsey Graham, Namrata Randhava, they're all morons, okay? I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. But what I care about is the next generation should have healthcare, education, a clean environment, chances to have a living wage, buy a house. These are not bad things for anybody to have. And it's the same thing in this country. I think it's disgraceful that 1/3 of the children under 5 are stunted. And credit to India as a democracy that put out this data. There are a lot of countries in the world which wouldn't do it. Okay. So criticality wise, it's not that I'm critical. It's that somebody has to bring this up, because if you shout long enough, somebody will pay attention to you. You know,
That's why you're always welcome here.
somebody in chat.
No, yes, we already answered that question. So
Webmaster.
we have a kind of technology.
Oh, okay, but that's all that way.
So with that, please join me in thanking Professor Amit Gupta. Thank you, Amit. You're always welcome here.